During the time that you were ambassador to the Soviet Union, it was the Gorbachev era. What were some of the events or the crises or the personalities that really stand out in your mind? I mean, I'm sure there was so much happening at that time, but what in particular are the things that you remember the most and that you would like to tell people about the Gorbachev era in the Soviet Union?
Oh gosh, there are so many of them. But how many do you want? Let's see. Let me start with one in which struck me at the time very, very deeply. It happened in, must have been September '87, if I'm correct.
Okay.
Let's see, it was it 88, September
of '88.
88.
Okay.
Secretary of State Schultz was meeting here in New York with Edward Shevardnadze, the Soviet foreign minister. He had come to the General Assembly session, and they normally had a bilateral meeting. And by this time, they had gotten to know each other pretty well. Schultz had gone out of his way to develop a personal relationship with Shevardnadze, and Shevardnadze and his wife had reciprocated this. So by that time, they were on a first-name basis. And Schultz, as he always did, began the first private part of the meeting. Private in that sense. There were a couple of others on each side there, but it was not a big meeting. He began it by giving Shevardnadze a list of what we call a representation list of human rights cases.
Okay.
Either people waiting for exit visas or having been imprisoned, we thought, for political reasons or other things. And we had done this for some years, and Gromyko, his predecessor, had always given us a lecture on how it was none of our business.
Right.
And this was sheer interference in their internal affairs, etc.
Yes.
This time, Shevardnadze took it and said, George, let me tell you, I'll take this back to Moscow.
Wow.
And we'll check into it, and if what you say is true, I'll do my best to correct the situation.
Wow.
And then he paused and he said, but I want you to know one thing. I'm not doing this because you asked me to. I'm doing this because it's what my country needs to do.
Oh my goodness.
Schultz stood up, put out his hand. Shevardnadze stood up, and as they shook hands, Schultz said, Edward, let me assure you, I will never ask you to do something I do not think is in your country's interest.
Wow.
Cold War was over.
Wow.
I had trouble suppressing tears.
I bet. You're making me cry as I'm sitting here listening to this. That's incredible.
And then, you know, we were able to develop these, I would say, closer and closer personal relationships with their senior people like Alexander Besmertnik, who had served both in New York and in Washington at their embassy and UN representation, and then headed the American division, then was a deputy foreign minister, and then foreign minister briefly in the Soviet Union's last year. And this was encouraged on both sides, I would say, by Gorbachev and Shevardnadze, and on our side by first Reagan and then Bush and their secretaries of state. Mm-hmm. So we increasingly we developed personal relationships, sometimes with people we'd known for years, like Besmertnik I had dealt with, you know, in the 70s when he was, you know, a more junior officer in the Soviet embassy in Washington. So this was important, but it was also important, to getting back to my training, that as we developed a closer relationship, it was necessary to handle a lot of things very discreetly, and to be able to go in. And in Moscow, I always did all of my business in Russian, unless I was with, you know, a more senior person who didn't know Russian, in which case. And if it was sensitive, I would go in by myself and handle it personally with the foreign minister or with Gorbachev later. And this led to the fact that we developed I would say, a very good confidential relationship. I was very careful, you know, to keep it discreet, and if it was something sensitive. And I recall that on one occasion, this very important occasion, just a few days before the Lithuanians declared a restoration of their independence.
Oh, yes.
This was in the spring of '90. I was meeting regularly when they asked for it with the new elected leaders in the 3 Baltic countries. And they had made an appointment for a Friday morning, I think, about 10 o'clock. And I had a call from the foreign ministry the day before asking me if I would come in at, I think, 8:39, very early for the diplomatic business, by myself to meet Shevardnadze.
Okay.
And of course I went over, and since they wanted to keep it private, I didn't take my car with the flag on it. I actually walked from my residence to the foreign ministry, which is not far, if you know Wasco. And went in, and we were one-on-one, little table no bigger than that between us. And as I came down, he greeted me. We sat down. I looked, and his notes were written in Georgian.
Oh my
which
goodness.
meant that he had written the notes for that time,
Oh my
because
goodness.
his immediate staff in the foreign ministry didn't know Georgian.
Okay. Wow.
And he had obviously just come or had come from Gorbachev. And his message was, is there anything we could do to have the Lithuanians postpone their Declaration of Independence? And as he put it, we know they're going to do it, but if they can wait a week, 10 days, we can handle it. If they do it this weekend, there's great danger.
Oh no.
Now, they were worried about a coup against Gorbachev, of course, to remove him, because what was coming up on Monday was a vote to create the office. Well, they had already, I guess, created the office of president, and there was to be the vote in the Congress of People's Deputies to name Gorbachev the president of the USSR, which would be a new office and obviously different powers. And he said, you know, if this happens before that, who knows what will happen. Once the presidency is established, we can take care of it. Is there any way we can get them to delay? And I told him, and he asked in particular, would you cancel your meeting this morning? That your people, our people, he said, in this case meaning the KGB, thinks you and the US is behind all of this. Well, of course, we weren't. We had been listening, but I had actually warned the Lithuanians and the others that if they declared their independence, we could not recognize it because, well, both for practical and legal reasons, they would not be in full control of their country, and that could well bring about suppression by the Soviets, which we could not protect them from. And I told him I can't cancel this meeting. And I looked at my watch and I said they're due at 10 o'clock and they'll probably be there. And if I cancel, it's going to be all over the press in the States, and it'll be a real mess, you know, politically. So he said, well, you know, keep the meeting as short as possible. Well, I went back, and actually I was getting the flu or something. I was feeling terrible. As I walked in to the gate, the Lithuanians, including headed by Landsbergis, who became their first president independently, was coming in the gate to my residence, so I had to meet with them. And they were telling me, yes, they planned on Sunday to declare a restoration of their independence. And I said, why the rush? Well, we have to do it before Gorbachev becomes president of the USSR.
Wow.
And I said, look, I must tell you, frankly, your understanding of the political forces here are not the same as mine.
Okay.
And I'm just wondering, why is it you think if he wants to crush you, he cannot do so as Secretary General of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union?
Right.
I got no answer.
Oh boy.
But in any event, I did excuse myself quite legitimately because
you were
my
ill.
fever then was probably well over 100, and
Wow.
I was feeling lousy. And I left it with my political counselor to talk to them, but trying to get across the idea that there was no real reason to rush it.
Right.
Although obviously I couldn't go into more detail than that.
Right.
So actually they were determined to go, and I went back to Shevardnadze the next morning, it was a Saturday morning, and reported on that. And I told him that frankly, that number one, we were not teleguiding them. We were doing our best to advise them to keep everything peaceful. And we were making it clear that there was no way that we could protect them if there was a crackdown. But that I did not know how one could deter them. But I said, here's an idea, and I've not checked it with anybody. And I know that most likely this won't be acceptable, but they might delay it if President Bush called Landsbergis and asked him to. And it could at least imply that if they delay, they have some assurance that eventually the independence will be recognized.
Oh my!
And I said,
there was real bargaining
I understand the delicacy of all of this, and obviously we won't do anything unless you tell us. And he said, well, don't, let me check with Gorbachev.
Yeah.
And later he sent word, no, don't do anything.
Okay.
And I recognized, look, if we do that and it leaks, I mean, it's going to be the end of Gorbachev, among other things. And you just couldn't depend. But actually they did go through the declaration of the restoration of their independence. And then Gorbachev did get elected president. It was very dicey. But it did happen, and then his response was a very mild one in a certain extent. He declared certain economic boycotts for a while and whatnot, sort of went through the motions of trying to oppose the declaration, but our assessment was he couldn't accept it in that way without getting removed himself.
Exactly.
But this was not the assessment of the Lithuanians. Well, so that's one of the things. Another was when there was an attack on the tower in Vilnius in January '91. President Bush sent a letter, a fairly long letter, it was about 3.5 pages if I remember, to Gorbachev, saying that if the violence continued in the Baltics, we would have to stop cooperation in a number of the areas that we had agreed to cooperate. And I decided I better deliver this personally, and I did. I took it in and translated it for him, sitting there. I remember at one point when I translated, we would have to take certain steps. I said pretty much "некоторые меры," and I remember Gorbachev said steps, это шаги. And I said, да, no. Какая разница?
Miri sounds better in Russian.
So he could pick up a few words of English
That's very
at least.
interesting.
But in any event, when I had read the letter, his first question was, Jack, tell me, did George say that he has taken these measures or he will take them? And I said, he said that if violence continued in the Baltic, he would be forced to take them. And then, much to my astonishment, he looked at me and said, how do you assess the situation here?
Wow.
Tell me. Well, that had been a couple of months after he had started what we call his turn to the right, which had been in November '89, when Rishkov had been replaced by this was '91, so
Okay.
it was November '90,
Right.
and that he had the turn to the right. In December, Shevardnadze had resigned.
Yes, I remember that.
He had put in hardliners as Minister of Internal Affairs, Pugo, and had named Pavlov, probably one of the most incompetent prime ministers they ever had. And I was really astounded, but I thought, well, he's asked me, so I'm going to tell him.
Yes.
And I must have talked for 20 minutes or so. I said, you know, Mr. President, I thought I knew what you had in mind, and I've been explaining that to my government, but for the last couple of months I'm perplexed.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what's going on.
My goodness.
And I named a number of these things.
Yes.
He listened carefully and occasionally would, as if he was making notes,
Mm-hmm.
and he heard me out, and then he said, in fact, please, please help your president understand what is going on in this country. And he said, "Это страна на грани гражданской войны."
Oh my goodness.
This is a country on the brink of a civil war.
Civil War. Yeah.
And as its leader, I must do everything possible
Wow.
to avoid that.
Wow.
And he said, that means I've got to tack with the wind. My goals are just like they used to be. They're still there,
Interesting.
but bear with me. We have to, I'm going to have to, at times,
Yeah.
look as if I'm heading in a different direction.
Yeah.
And then he said, help your president understand that.
Wow.
And then he added, and this was the real clincher, I know your president will have to do what he has to do, but whatever happens, I will keep all my promises.
Oh my goodness.
And one of them, of course, was to continue to condemn the invasion of Iraq, and this was just at the brink of the Gulf War.
Okay.
And we were trying to keep them on board, of course.
Right, right.
And in effect, he was saying, okay, even if you sanction me, I'll stick with you. And as I told Bush after that, look, what can you do?
Right.
I think he's going to try to control it, but let's not go beating up on him, in effect.
Right.
So we had that sort of relationship, and that meant that later, in July of '91, I had also developed close relationships with Yeltsin, with the Democrats, Popov, the mayor, and so on. We had, in those last couple of years, I was in Moscow, somewhere between 15 and 18 social functions a week at our residence. Everything from working breakfast to lunches to receptions to lectures, dinners. And I had a terrific staff to organize this, but we really had gotten to know, and not just officially, but socially.
It was all personal connections.
Almost every faction in the country.
Yeah.
And we had officers who spoke several of the non-Russian languages, so that, when Gomsekuria was going to do something special in Georgia, he would call our officer who covered Georgia and say, come down and take a look. This is going to happen.
My goodness.
And we, it was incredible, I think, the way our staff was able to get out once it was opened up.
That's fantastic.
But in any event, I had developed a good relationship with Popov, who was then mayor of Moscow, elected mayor. And he had been invited to a lunch, and he called to say he couldn't come to lunch. He wondered if he could call on me earlier. I had already announced that I was leaving that summer, and I was beginning to do farewell calls and things, and he said, I'd like to pay a farewell call. And so I said, well, come at noon. The lunch was to be at 1 o'clock. And so I met him in the study at the residence, and while we talked about city politics, he wrote a note and the note said that a coup is being organized against Gorbachev.
Oh my goodness.
And we must get word to Boris Nikolaevich. Now, Yeltsin was in Washington.
Oh my goodness.
And he was not informing us, he was trying to get word to Yeltsin to come back.
Oh my goodness.
And well, he wrote the note in Russian, and as we talked about other things, because we assumed that the house was bugged, and since we didn't use it to conspire, we thought we never tried to clean it, because that would have just been ridiculous with all of the social functions we had. We had to be open and have access. So so I jotted down kto это организует, who is organizing this, and he then wrote 4 names down. It was Khrushchev,
the head of the KGB.
Yazov, Pavlov, and Lukyanov.
Oh my goodness.
And then as we talked, he picked up the paper, tore it in little bits, and stuck it in his coat pocket.
Yeah.
We continued to talk for a while, and he took his leave. And of course, I immediately called Jim Collins, my deputy. Jim was later ambassador to Russia for several years. And I said, come over before the lunch. I've got to talk to you. Yeah. And I wrote out a message on on a legal pad, to Washington. All of our messages go first to the Secretary of State.
Right.
And the message was that please get this message to Yeltsin. Because we knew that Yeltsin had a meeting with Bush at 10 that morning, Washington time. Yeah. And of course, we had this 8-hour advantage over the time.
Wow.
And so I sent the message, and a few hours later, I got a call saying that the president would like me to warn Gorbachev.
My goodness.
And then we discussed, this was on a secure phone.
Yeah.
We had just gotten a secure telephone just a few months before that. Most of my career there, we didn't have secure voice communications.
Wow.
That was new technology for us. But in any event, in discussion with them, I said, now look, I can't go to the president of the Soviet Union and tell him that the head of the KGB, the head of his security, his defense minister, his prime minister, and the chairman of parliament are conspiring against him. We can't prove that.
Yeah.
I mean, we have this word. I think what we need to do is say we have a report which is more than a rumor, but we cannot confirm, but is sufficiently serious that the president wished me to convey it to you. They said, yes, that's absolutely right, keep it there.
Yeah.
And so I called Chernyayev, his foreign policy assistant, and said, I wonder if I could see the president urgently. And he got me right in. It was, this was most unusual to be able to go on almost no notice.
Wow.
Well, it was a strange meeting because, again, I had already announced that I would be leaving Moscow soon and so on. And when I entered, Gorbachev started praising me because I had publicly, my wife and I, she had played a very active role in the cultural area, had been really very supportive of perestroika and the changes that were occurring. And this was well known, and he greeted me as Tavarish Basol. And I thought, boy, I'm not going to put this in my cable. And then he added, I'm not saying that you're loyal to anybody but your own country.
Yeah. Comrade ambassador.
But but your role and your wife's role have been very supportive of us, of what we're doing in this country. Anyway, so this sort of put me off balance a bit, but then I went through and I said, well, President Bush asked me to come, and that we had this report that was more than a rumor, but we could not confirm it, that a conspiracy was being organized against us and could occur at about any time. Well, his first reaction was to laugh, turn to Cherniaev, who was the only other person in the room, and say something about the naive Americans. And then he turned to me and sobered up, and instead of laughing, and said, "Look, I can assure you that everything is okay, but tell your president he's done the right thing. That we have declared ourselves his friends, and now he's proven it.
Okay.
But, you know, rest assured, there's nothing to that. I know that these podполковники, these lieutenant colonels, there were several in politics, are talking about coups against me and so on, and I suppose your intelligence has picked that up. But, you know, everything is well at hand, and as you'll see tomorrow. Now, one thing behind all of this was that on Monday of that week, this was Thursday, there had been an attempt during a closed session of the Supreme Soviet to take some of, to give some of the presidential powers to the prime minister.
Yes, I remember.
And this had immediately leaked to the press, though it was a closed session, and there was outrage. And Gorbachev had said he hadn't authorized it. Well, so there was this parliamentary battle going on. Behind the scenes it started, but then it was bubbling up. Actually, he did go the next day before Parliament and had it voted down. And that's what he had in mind.
Okay.
But in fact, the report we had turned out to be true.
Yes.
But it's more complicated than that.
Okay.
And I know I'm going on longer than I should.
But these are good stories.
But this is, the interesting thing was the next day, finally, Bush got through to Gorbachev on the telephone. Now, he had tried to call him the day before, but the KGB didn't put the call through. Cherniaev writes in his diary, he and Gorbachev were infuriated that they didn't put the call through from Bush.
Okay.
But they apparently had instructions not to.
Okay.
He finally got the call through, and during the call, he actually mentioned Popov's name. Now, you know, Popov had been my source, and of course that was the one name that should under no circumstances be mentioned.
Whoops.
And I'll have to say for the Bush administration, they did call me on the secure line and said, unfortunately, the president let the name of your source out.
Oh, no.
I couldn't imagine. After Bush had been director of the CIA at one point in his career.
Yes, you would think that he would know better.
And both he and Baker simply forgot at times that the KGB controlled all communications. With foreigners in the Soviet Union. Popov was named. I would say later, when I looked at a declassified record of the telephone conversation, it went sort of like this. That Bush had said, "Did you see Matlock yesterday?" And Gorbachev said, "Yeah, thank you, but as I told him, everything is well at hand. It's 1,000% that your reports have no foundation," or something like that. I remember he used 1,000%. And then Bush said, "Well, you know, I wouldn't have bothered you with it, but Yeltsin and Popov wanted you to know." And now Yeltsin had said, when they gave Yeltsin the message, they asked him, "What should we do?" And he said, "You better warn Gorbachev." So yeah, it was okay to name Yeltsin. And the whole reason Bush called Gorbachev then was to say, "Yes, I met with Yeltsin. He has pledged to me that he's going to support you." Because we were then trying to use our relationship with Yeltsin to keep them together. We didn't want to see the Soviet Union broken up the way it was going. And we were doing our best to persuade Yeltsin that it was in their interest to support Gorbachev and stop undermining him. And that was the whole thrust, and Bush was trying to reassure him. But then the mention of Popov, And the Popov later told me when I met him, several months later, and said, "Can I talk about all of this?" He said, "Of course." And he said, that when I came to the reception, when Bush, he finally visited Moscow, and at the end of July, these events were in late June that I just said. Well, he came in July, and at one of the receptions, Gorbachev shook his finger at Popov when he came and said, "Why are you telling these fairy tales to the Americans?"
Oh my.
And he said he suddenly realized that somebody, and he told me, he said, "I couldn't imagine that you were so indiscreet, but how could it happen?" And I said, "Well, I'm sorry, it was the president who mentioned your name."
Wow.
And then to my surprise, he said, Popov said, "It was probably a good thing." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Once my name was mentioned, Khrushchev knew he had a leak. He had to stop planning the coup."
Oh, interesting.
And he said, and that's probably the reason it was not properly planned and it failed.
Okay, that's really interesting. Wow. So what looked like a failure turned out to be a success.
That's right.
Oh, that's fabulous. That's
So,
fabulous.
I mean, these were times, and there's even more to this one, in that my cable went to, of course, first to Baker, who was Secretary of State, as well as to the White House. He was in Berlin, and so was Besmertnik, the then foreign minister.
Yes, yes.
His first attempt was to warn Besmertnik.
Okay.
And he called, he got the cable in Berlin, and he called Besmertnik and said, "I need to see you." And Besmertnik said, "Jim, I've got a full schedule this evening. Could we meet in the morning?" He said, "No, I don't want to see you today. Cancel what you're doing."
Oh my.
And so he went to Besmertnik and gave him the 4 names. Mm-hmm. He said, "We had this warning, and these were the names." And he said, "You got to warn Gorbachev." And Besmertnik said, "Jim, I can't warn Gorbachev. It's hard for me to believe those names are there, but if that's true, I have no private channel.
Oh my goodness.
I can't do it." And
When
he said, "If you're going to warn Gorbachev, Jack has to do it."
Wow.
In other words,
Wow.
And so that's the reason they called me.
goodness.
And then so Baker said, "Okay, then make sure he can see Gorbachev." So Besmertnik called Chernyayev and says, "If Matlock asks for an appointment, take him right in."
Okay.
And so he set that up. But then when he came back to Moscow on Saturday, he said he had no private meeting with Gorbachev, but he did ask him, "Did you see the American ambassador?" And Gorbachev said, "Yes, I did, and I've got to talk to those fellows." So Besmertnik thought I had given, he said they were actually, it was a wreath laying or something.
Okay.
And it was not a private meeting. They were sort of walking together and chatting. And he said he assumed that I had given Gorbachev the names, so he didn't.
Okay.
And it wasn't appropriate for him
Right.
to at that point.
Yeah.
But it showed one thing. It shows how close our personal relationship
That's
had gotten with
incredible.
these
That
people.
really is
and at the
incredible.
same time, even earlier than that, at one point, Gorbachev had told Baker in one of their meetings, and it was one of their private meetings, that Yeltsin had asked me what the U.S. would do if there was an unconstitutional change of power.
Right.
And I know Baker said, "We didn't get any report like that. I can't imagine that happened. Matlock would have reported it. Let's have him in." I was sitting in another room. He said, no, he didn't do anything wrong. I'm just telling you what sort of fellow this Yeltsin is."
Okay.
And so when Baker came out, he said, "Gorbachev seems to think that that Yeltsin might be preparing a coup."
Oh my
and I said, "This is absurd. Who is going to conduct a coup for Yeltsin?
Right.
The party hates him. The KGB hates him. The
Yeah.
army hates him."
Yeah.
I said, "That's fabulous." And I said, "Of course he never even implied anything like that." And so he said, "Well, you better let Gorbachev know."
Yeah.
So, and this had occurred back in April, I think, of
Okay.
'91. So I went first to Chernyayev and told him that this hadn't happened. And Chernyayev said, you know, I heard Gorbachev say that. I had not seen the report. But I'll certainly tell him this is very important. And I'll certainly tell him, but you should tell him directly.
Okay.
And I said, fine, get me an appointment. And I went back to the embassy, and the very next day I got a fairly routine letter from Bush to Gorbachev, one that would normally be handled by the foreign ministry, because it had to do with the detail in one of the treaties we were negotiating, which clearly would have gone through the staff before it was answered. But I called Chernyayev and I said, I have a letter if you want to get me an appointment. Normally I wouldn't ask for an appointment for this. I'd take it up with Shevardnadze, but given our conversation yesterday, perhaps I should see him. Again, he got me right in, and I told him, you know, Baker tells me you said that Yeltsin said this. This never happened. Yeltsin has never in the slightest bit hinted that he had any intentions of violating the Constitution in any way. And Gorbachev actually accepted it almost without quibble. Then he gave me a long lecture about how influential my wife and I were in Soviet society, and how, you know, maybe we were seeing some factions more than others, and so on. And I finally said, Mr. President, we invite everybody. If some come more often than others, that's their choice.
Yeah, exactly.
In other words, the whole political spectrum. And as I left that meeting, Chernyayev walked out with me and said, that's very important. And the very next day, Gorbachev renewed the Novo-Ogaryovo negotiations with Yeltsin and the others.
That ended up
the very next day, and it was very interesting how they actually tried to signal in the ways we would signal, because they released a short statement to the press saying that President Gorbachev had received the American ambassador to receive a friendly message from his president, following which there was a very important exchange of views. In other words, message to us, okay, message received.
That's really interesting.